the receptionist at Commercial Credit Union in Houston, Texas, called over to Bradley Stokes, one of the assistant vice presidents, with an unexpected announcement. "Mr. Stokes, there are 2 visitors here who say they need to speak with you." Bradley glanced from his computer screen to his appointment book. He was confident he hadn't scheduled anything for Monday at 9:30 a.m., but double-checked anyway, as he hadn't reviewed his calendar since leaving the previous Friday afternoon. Relieved he hadn't overlooked anything, the 36-year-old Stokes instructed her to send them in. When the visitors reached his office door, Stokes stood up, his 6-foot frame rising behind the desk as he extended his hand. Before him stood 2 strangers, a tall, distinguished older man with blonde-gray hair and a young blonde woman who looked to be in her early 20s. They seemed to be a grandfather and granddaughter, Stokes thought, puzzled by why they would ask to meet him specifically. After shaking hands and formally introducing himself, Stokes invited them to sit across from him. The older man, before speaking, made a request. "You might want to close the door. What we have to discuss is personal, not business." Surprised by the statement, Stokes raised his eyebrows, but complied, returning to his seat and looking intently at the older man's pale blue eyes. "We apologize for interrupting your work, but this seemed like the best time to approach you," the man began. "I don't know how much you've been told, if anything, about us. My name is Philip Erickson, and this is my daughter, Bridget. I'm your biological father, and she is your half-sister." Stokes froze, his mouth slightly open, stunned into silence. "I take it your mother, or maybe both your parents, never mentioned me?" Erickson asked gently. Stokes could only sit there, struggling to form any words as he processed the bombshell dropped on him. "I assure you, what I'm telling you is the truth," Erickson continued. "Your mother and I had an affair nearly 37 years ago, and you were the result. The man you know as your father probably didn't know at the time, and he either still doesn't or agreed to raise you as his own. If you want confirmation, you could take a DNA test. I've already done one, and my results are in the system, along with my family tree. I don't expect your mother would have told you the truth about this, and as for the man who raised you, don't you dare insult my father, you old bastard," Stokes erupted, causing both visitors to recoil slightly in their chairs. "I know this is difficult, having a stranger walk in and claim to be your real father, but it's the truth," Erickson said quietly. "I'm sorry to spring this on you after all these years." "If you're so sorry, then why are you doing this now?" Stokes demanded, his voice sharp with anger. "I had hoped your mother or your parents would have told you long ago, and you would have tried to find me. But I lost hope after waiting for over 20 years. Now, though, I don't have much time left. I've been diagnosed with the early stages of dementia, and I'm trying to settle things before my mind slips away," Erickson explained, his voice heavy with the weight of his condition. Stokes studied the pair in front of him, as if seeing apparitions. He couldn't deny that they shared his coloring. Throughout his life, he had assumed he resembled his Nordic mother more than his Southern European father. Yet here, sitting across from him, were 2 people who mirrored aspects of his own appearance in ways that were hard to ignore. "I'm Norwegian on my father's side, and Finnish on my mother's," Erickson continued, pride creeping into his tone. "Our lineage traces back to the Vikings. I have 4 children, 3 with Bridget's mother, and you're the oldest. Mallory is the youngest." Stokes, still processing, asked hesitantly, "How old are you?" "You look a little too old for my mother." "I'm 74, Erickson replied. "I believe your mother was about 10 years younger than me. She was a young secretary in the history department at Harvard, and I was a tenured professor." Much of what the older man said aligned with what Bradley Stokes knew about his family, except for the revelation about his father. His parents had lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for several years during the early years of their marriage. In fact, both he and his older sister April had been born there. Stokes also knew his mother had worked at the university, while his father had been employed as a mechanical engineer in the city. "I remember after your sister was born, your mother was self-conscious about the weight she'd gained during pregnancy. It was only about 20 pounds, but she was worried your father wouldn't be happy with her," Philip Erickson began, recalling details that struck a chord with Stokes. "She was talking about it one day at lunch in the cafeteria, and I remember thinking that your father was a fool if he couldn't see how beautiful she still was. I started making excuses to stop by her office in the history department, complimenting her. I knew what I was doing. I've always been a ladies' man. I knew how to charm women, to make them feel special. I knew what to say to get them into bed." Stokes' face tightened at the blunt confession, but he remained silent as Erickson continued, Yes, I was married at the time, but I was looking for more than just sex. Although for me, it didn't go much beyond that. But your mother, I think, felt it was something more. We even talked about her leaving your father for me, but then my wife got pregnant with our first child, and I couldn't leave her. Fortunately, your mother hadn't told your father anything, so she just carried on like nothing had happened. I didn't ask whether she ever planned to tell him. That was between them. It was their marriage. Stokes shot him a cold, sarcastic glance. How considerate of you, not wanting to intrude, he muttered. Erickson pressed on. From what she told me, she loved your father. She was just feeling insecure, and I was there to boost her confidence. We began our affair about a year after your sister was born, and 2 months later, she was pregnant with you. Stokes exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath as the older man's story came to an end. His parents had moved to Indiana shortly after his birth, and his younger sister Lindsay had been born 2 years later. Even though I wasn't a part of your life, I kept track of you all these years, Erickson confessed. Stokes knew he and Lindsay had always taken after their mother in appearance, both inheriting her fair complexion, so he had never questioned it. Now, with Erickson's revelation, he found himself considering the possibility that it wasn't just genetics from his mother's side. Stokes sat in silence for what felt like a long time. 30 seconds passed before he finally spoke. So, bottom line, what do you want from me, Mr. Erickson? Just acknowledgement that I exist, at least biologically. Erickson responded, his voice soft but sincere. It seems your mother or your parents chose not to tell you about me, and that was their decision. But I've always known about you and that you were a part of me. Tears welled up in the older man's eyes as he stood, with Bridget following suit. Stokes, unsure of what to do, rose as well. Assuming the meeting had ended, he extended his hand for a handshake, but instead, Erickson pulled him into a brief but emotional hug that lasted just long enough to make Stokes feel the weight of the encounter. That's all I wanted, son. Thank you for your time, Erickson said softly before he and Bridget walked out of the office, leaving Stokes standing alone in stunned silence. For several minutes, Stokes sat in his chair, his thoughts racing uncontrollably. He would definitely need to take a DNA test to confirm Erickson's story, but if everything he'd been told was true, he now faced an immense dilemma. Up until that morning, Craig Stokes had been the only father Brad had ever known. He idolized Craig, and as he grew older, their relationship had deepened from father and son to close friends. But now, Brad found himself grappling with questions he wasn't sure how to answer. Starting with the most critical one. Did Craig know that Brad wasn't biologically his? If Craig had never known, telling him would shatter his heart. But if Craig eventually discovered that Brad had known and kept it from him, wouldn't that be an even greater betrayal? The very thought of either scenario filled Brad with dread, and he didn't know which path to take. Brad initially considered approaching his mother after meeting with Philip Erickson, but a troubling thought stopped him. If his father was unaware of the affair, then his mother had been lying to him for years and might continue the deception. The only scenario that wouldn't completely shatter everything was if both his parents already knew and had chosen not to tell him. That way, Brad figured there would be some hurt feelings, but not the kind of family-rending confrontation he dreaded. His head hit the desk with a heavy thud. I hate Mondays, he muttered to the empty room. Brad immediately went to the website and ordered a DNA kit. He knew it would take several weeks for the results to come in, giving him time he wished he could use to somehow transport himself to another universe. Weeks passed, and sure enough, the DNA results confirmed what Philip Erickson had told him. Erickson was indeed his biological father. Despite the confirmation, Brad decided to stay silent. He knew it was the easy way out, but he couldn't bear to hurt Craig, the man he had always considered his true father. Craig had been his rock, his guide through life. The last thing Brad wanted was to break the heart of the man he loved more than anything. Ironically, around the same time, Craig Stokes was thrilled when his own DNA kit arrived in the mail. Having been curious about his family history for years, he had joined the site the year before and was steadily building his family tree. Craig, a mechanical engineer by trade, was meticulous about everything he did, including tracing his roots. His wife of 41 years, Diana, observed his enthusiasm with a bemused smile, watching her husband like he was a kid with a new toy. While Craig dug into the genealogical work, Diana paid little attention. She had family Bibles stretching back nearly 300 years. Something Craig found fascinating, but not essential in his own quest to unearth hidden branches of his lineage. Craig and Brad were extremely close, often talking weekly about everything from politics to sports. Brad admired his father deeply, and had always treated his wife, Sandra, with the same respect and reverence Craig showed Diana throughout their marriage. But despite their closeness, Brad still hadn't turned in the DNA test his father had excitedly gifted him. He couldn't bring himself to do it. 2 months later, Craig's confusion grew. "Why haven't you sent in your DNA test? You'll love it. You'll get to connect with family we didn't even know we had," he said, his voice full of enthusiasm. Brad hesitated before responding softly. "Dad, I don't need to do the test. I already did it. And you won't find me in your family tree. I'm not your biological son." The words landed like a bomb. "What?" Craig responded, his voice thick with disbelief. "What do you mean you're not my son? Of course you are." "No, Dad, I'm not," Brad replied, barely audible. "A man named Philip Erickson visited me last year. Does that name mean anything to you?" Craig paused, puzzled. Sensing the weight of the conversation, Brad pressed, "Dad, are you somewhere private? You need to be alone for this." Craig glanced toward the family room where Diana was watching TV, then walked outside to the porch swing. "Okay, I'm alone." "Talk to me, Brad," he said, his voice more serious than Brad had heard in years. Brad explained everything. How Philip and Bridget had visited him, how Philip claimed to be his biological father, and how the DNA test had confirmed it all. He apologized profusely, admitting he had hoped to never have to tell Craig, especially since he wasn't sure whether his father had known the truth all along. Craig's voice cracked as he nearly shouted, "Raise you as mine? You are mine, Brad. I don't care what any DNA test says, but for whatever reason your mother never told me about any of this. I had no idea. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. You know I would never want to cause you pain." "I know, son, I know," Craig said, his voice softer now. "This isn't your fault. It should never have been your problem." Brad asked, "So what are you going to do now?" "After drinking a bottle of whiskey? I don't know," Craig replied, half joking, half serious. "I always thought your mom and I were in this for the long haul, growing old together. Maybe we still can. But right now, my heart feels like it's breaking. We might not even last another 10 minutes. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Brad said, his voice full of regret. "I'll call you in a few days, son." "I love you," Craig said quietly. "Love you too, Dad. Bye." Craig staggered back into the house after his call with Brad, barely making it to the bathroom before vomiting. After cleaning himself up, he headed straight to the liquor cabinet, pulling out a bottle of whiskey. He grabbed a glass and slumped into a kitchen chair, pouring himself a drink and downing it quickly. His mind raced as he poured a second, then a third. The question that haunted him with every gulp was, "Are any of them really mine?" "Babe, are you okay? What are you doing in there?" Diana's voice called from the family room. Craig stared blankly at the bottle as he contemplated her question. "Am I okay?" he thought bitterly. "No, I'm not okay. How could I be, when everything I thought I knew might be a lie?" As the alcohol started to numb him, the anger inside began to boil. He even considered, for a fleeting moment, storming into the family room and choking Diana for the betrayal. But he resisted, proving once again that he was, as everyone said, a calm and reflective man. Instead, he downed a sixth shot, slamming the glass down on the table. His chest felt tight, and he wondered if it was the alcohol or if he was on the verge of a heart attack. Either way, his life felt like it was crashing down around him. Only hours ago, the thought that Diana had cheated on him was inconceivable. Now, it was an undeniable fact, confirmed by their son. 43 years of marriage, built on trust, or so he thought, had been undermined by an affair she had kept hidden. The worst part was, for decades, Craig had cherished the early years of their relationship, never suspecting anything. He remembered the first time they met, standing in line at a McDonald's near their college campus. Diana, in her tight jeans and pink sweater, had caught his eye. When she smiled at him, that was all it took. They started talking, and a couple of months later, they were inseparable. Those memories, once cherished, now felt hollow. After graduation, they married and moved to Cambridge, where Diana worked at the university's history department, and Craig built his engineering career. 2 kids later, they relocated to Indiana, and life seemed to fall into place. But now, Craig couldn't help but question every moment. Diana had worked long hours back in those days, and now it all made sense. Why would a history department admin need to stay late so often? Craig thought bitterly. I'm a goddamn fool. The next afternoon, Diana was surprised to see Craig's car already in the driveway when she got home from work. He rarely left the office early. Concerned, she called out, "Hun, are you okay?" "No," came the quiet, unsettling response from the kitchen. Startled, Diana walked in and saw Craig sitting at the table, 2 cups of coffee already poured. She sat down cautiously, confused by the tension in the air. Craig stared straight ahead, not meeting her gaze. "Are any of the children mine, Diana?" Craig's voice was low, his words like ice. Diana's face went pale as her eyes widened in shock. Of all the things she expected to discuss today, this wasn't even remotely on the list. "What?" she whispered, barely able to form the word. "Are any of them mine?" Craig repeated, his eyes now fixed on her, piercing through her as if he could see the truth in her soul. Diana dropped her gaze, unable to hold his. "2," she finally croaked. "The girls are yours." Craig let out a bitter laugh. "So says my lying wife," he spat. "Well, that's why they invented DNA testing." "There's no need for insults, Craig," Diana snapped, trying to regain control of the conversation. "It's not an insult if it's the truth," Craig shot back. His voice was harsher now, years of pent-up betrayal breaking through. "How? Why? And how did you think this would stay hidden forever? How did you even find out, Craig?" "Our son," Craig replied, his tone sharp and biting. "Yes, my son. Because he's still mine, no matter what. Got a visit from your lover last year. Philip Erickson, remember him? He wanted to see the son he never knew before his dementia robbed him of the chance." Diana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the reality hit her. "Philip? He came to see Brad? You've known this for a year?" "No, Brad is known for a year," Craig said, his voice shaking with both anger and hurt. "He kept your dirty little secret for a whole year. The only reason I know now is because I pushed him to take a DNA test. If I hadn't, I'd still be in the dark, and you'd continue pretending like you loved me." Tears filled Diana's eyes. "I do love you, Craig. I made a mistake, a lapse in judgment. Please, can we talk about this?" "A lapse in judgment?" Craig snapped, incredulous. "You had an affair for nearly a year, Diana. A year. That's not a lapse in judgment. That's a deliberate choice you made every single day. Don't downplay this." Diana broke into sobs. I know, I was wrong. I just didn't want to lose you, Craig." "Well, congratulations," Craig said coldly, "because now I'm the one deciding whether or not we stay together. And right now, I can't even stand to look at you." Diana broke down into sobs as Craig stood up, disgusted, and walked out of the kitchen into the family room. Later that night, he once again slept in the guest room, continuing his quiet separation from her. The following day, during his lunch break, Craig made a call to a divorce attorney recommended by a coworker who had gone through a similar situation. Being in a no-fault state like Indiana, Craig knew the divorce would likely result in a 50-50th split, and he might have to pay alimony, given the difference in their salaries. Still, he couldn't ignore the need to take control of his life. That evening, when Craig returned home, the delicious smell of dinner filled the house. He silently acknowledged to himself that he would miss her cooking. As they sat down for another quiet meal, Diana finally broke the silence. "Can we talk, Craig, please?" she asked, her voice tentative. Craig finished chewing, took a sip of wine, and then pointed at her. "I have only one question, Diana. Why?" Diana winced, knowing this question would come but still dreading it. She had considered giving a sanitized version of events, but decided that another lie could make things even worse. She hesitated and then began. "After April was born, I was feeling down about the extra weight I was carrying. Philip noticed and started complimenting me. He made me feel good about myself, just by talking. He was older, charming, and eventually things escalated. We had lunches, then dinners, and then, well, things became sexual. I knew it was wrong, especially because I loved you, but the sex was different. Not better, just exciting because it was forbidden. Then I got pregnant and didn't know whose baby it was, so I ended it. I thought about an abortion, but I couldn't go through with it. You know I don't believe in that. Craig listened stoically, occasionally sipping his coffee. The story wasn't much of a surprise, but it still stung. You owe me the whole truth, Diana, he said flatly, not some cleaned-up version. Diana's face twisted, realizing he wanted more detail. Philip was a strong, handsome man, 6'4", muscular and gentle. I guess I fell for him, hard. When I got pregnant, I thought the baby was probably his, but his features were similar to mine, so I knew you'd never suspect. Honestly, I wanted to have his baby, she admitted, realizing too late how damaging her words were. Craig winced. When did you know Brad wasn't mine? He asked. My gynecologist figured it out. The dates lined up with the week I was at the UCLA conference with the history department. Philip and I were together every night, and I was ovulating. You didn't keep track of that, and I knew you wouldn't put it together. Craig shook his head. So, I was just a fool. But you left out the part where Philip chose to stay with his wife instead of running off with you. I was just the fallback. I loved you, Craig, Diana protested. You weren't a fallback. We had Lindsay 3 years later because I wanted a future with you. You were a great father, and we've had a good life. Don't throw it all away now over something that happened more than 30 years ago. We're so close to growing old together. Throw it all away? Me? Craig's voice rose. You're blaming me now? You've been lying to me for nearly 4 decades. I haven't lied to you for 38 years. I loved you then, and I love you now. It's possible to love more than one person. To hell with your love, Craig snapped. You made me second in my own marriage. We made vows, Diana, vows to forsake all others. You broke those vows. You broke my trust. Diana's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't expected the full extent of Philip's involvement in Brad's life to come out, but apparently Brad had told Craig everything. Philip wanted to see his son before dementia took everything from him, Craig continued. Seems you two never settled on what you'd tell Brad about his real father. He wasn't sure if you'd told me, or if we had raised Brad together, knowing the truth. Dementia. Poor man, Diana said softly, surprising Craig with the tenderness in her voice. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, Craig replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But I'd feel better if his dick and balls had fallen off instead. Diana bit her lip, knowing better than to respond to that. She realized she wasn't going to win this fight. At best, she could hope for a stalemate. I was a fool for trusting you completely, Craig said, his voice quieter now. I should have questioned why a secretary in the history department needed to work late so often. But I had total faith in you. And now, I see what an idiot I was. The next day, Craig called Brad and filled him in on the previous night's events, including how Diana had tried to withhold the full truth. Brad could hear the strain in his father's voice as he tried to maintain his composure over the phone. Have you made a decision yet, Dad? You two have been together for so long. It would be a shame to throw it all away now, Brad said carefully. I haven't decided yet, Craig admitted, but it's hard to overlook the betrayal and the years of silence. She would have left me if he hadn't stayed with his wife. How are you doing, Dad? I know telling me this had to be hard. I'm sorry you've been dragged into this. Hardest thing I've ever had to hear, but don't worry, bud, we're good. None of this should have been your burden. You'll always be my son, no matter what. I know that, Dad, and you'll always be my father. After a pause, Craig asked, have you met with your other family yet? You've got a brother and 2 more sisters now, right? I haven't yet, but maybe I should, Brad replied. I used to think I had 2 sisters. Now, I've got 4 half-sisters, a half-brother, and a pretty messed up life. Later that day, Brad's phone rang again. This time, it was his mother. Mom, you know I'm working, right? Brad said, his tone laced with frustration. I'm sorry, Brad, Diana said softly. You know your father and I both love you very much. How could you do this, Mom? You cheated on Dad, got pregnant, and stayed silent for over 30 years. That's cold. I'm really sorry, Brad. I thought Philip and I would be together, but your father, Craig, was the best dad you could have had. I know that, Mom. We both do. Divorce papers were served to Diana a week later at her office. Craig got word from his lawyer right away, followed by a flurry of angry texts and calls from Diana, which he ignored. Instead, he picked up a pizza and a 6-pack on his way home, knowing the storm that awaited him. As soon as he stepped through the door, Diana unleashed her fury. Are you serious? You had to humiliate me by serving the papers at work, you selfish jerk. Honestly, yeah, it appealed to me, Craig replied coolly. Why should you get off easy after what you've done to me? That was decades ago. You didn't even know about it until now. I never took anything from you. I'm not going to apologize for something that happened almost 40 years ago. You need to get over it and move on. Get over it? I didn't realize there was a statute of limitations on breaking my heart, Craig shot back. I am moving on by giving you the divorce you should have gotten 38 years ago. You were ready to leave me for him until his wife got pregnant. He chose her, not you. And now, I'm choosing to leave you. Diana fought the divorce, and her lawyer managed to get the judge to order counseling. During the first session, the counselor, Mrs. Hoover, asked Craig about his feelings. Mr. Stokes, you seem unusually hurt by something that happened so long ago, she commented. To me, it didn't happen 40 years ago, Craig replied sharply. I just found out a few months ago, so the pain is still fresh. Diana chimed in. We've had a wonderful life together since then. My commitment to Craig can't be overlooked. Commitment? Craig snapped. You cheated on me for almost a year. You only stayed because your lover didn't want to leave his wife. You kept me as the backup plan. If he hadn't stayed with her, you would have left me. I was your second choice, and I never knew. His voice rose as his anger spilled out. His face flushed red as he shouted, I was nothing but your fallback. Mr. Stokes, please lower your voice, Valerie Hoover urged, trying to calm him. Craig let out a frustrated shout, too angry to respond rationally. Diana sat quietly, knowing this was a battle she couldn't win. At the next session, Diana asked to speak first. She desperately needed Craig to understand that her love for him was real. Craig, I apologize for breaking our vows, but I've always loved you. When I recommitted to you, I did so completely and never looked at another man. I came to realize my mistake and regretted it deeply. After that, I gave you every ounce of my love. That's why we had Lindsay. She was my gift to you and to our marriage. Craig looked into Diana's pleading eyes. He admitted to himself that if he hadn't found out about her affair, he would have gone to his grave believing they had a near-perfect marriage. In another time or place, he would have gotten up, embraced her, and offered comfort. But that wasn't their reality. The truth was out, her infidelity, her pregnancy with another man's child, and her admission that she would have left him if Philip hadn't chosen to stay with his pregnant wife. Any one of those truths alone could justify a divorce. All three combined made it hard to see a path forward, even with 43 years of shared love. Diana saw the conflict in Craig's expression, the way he avoided meeting her eyes. You would have left me for him, Craig whispered, his voice heavy with pain. He was your number one, and I was just an afterthought. If it hadn't been for circumstances, you would have left me. We wouldn't have had these last 38 years. I would have been alone. How is that love? But I didn't leave. I rediscovered you, Diana insisted. We've had a great marriage. You said so yourself. What I did was wrong, but I made up for it. I came back to you. Craig shook his head, his voice rising. It wasn't a great marriage. It was based on a lie. You deceived me. You can't call it love when the foundation is built on lies. If I had known, we would have divorced then and there. We took vows, Diana. Did they mean anything to you? At that moment, Craig broke down. Something Diana had never seen from him, except during the loss of his parents. It hit her hard. The realization that Craig was as hurt now as if the affair had just happened. The counselor, Mrs. Hoover, chimed in. Mrs. Stokes, I understand you want this to be resolved quickly, but your husband has a lot to process. This is still new to him. Reconciliation will be slow, and you both need to work hard to overcome these issues. Going into your retirement years with this unresolved could be difficult. Diana looked over at Craig, who met her gaze with a resigned shrug. I don't know, Diana, Craig said, his voice calmer now. The real question is, would I be better off with or without you? I keep getting two answers. I'd be better off with you, if only for the convenience. But it's not about convenience. Can I live with you, knowing you chose someone else? Knowing you lied for 38 years? Knowing that everything I thought was true about our life together was an illusion? Diana asked their 3 children to reach out to Craig and persuade him to stay in the marriage. Brad refused, telling her it wasn't his place to interfere, but both daughters didn't hesitate. Craig listened to their pleas, assuring them he would consider their requests, but warning that he couldn't make any promises. Please, Dad, don't break up the family over a mistake that happened 40 years ago, April begged. Let it go. Let me ask you something, April. Craig responded. "If Dennis cheated on you, would you forgive him?" "After I cut his balls off? Yeah, probably," she replied, half joking. A few days later, while Craig was shaving, the answer came to him, clear as day. Staring at his reflection in the mirror, he realized, yeah, you're right. At the next counseling session, Craig asked to speak first. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hoover," Craig began, "but I've made a decision. I can't stay with Diana, and I think we should stop these sessions." The counselor looked surprised. "What led to this conclusion, Mr. Stokes?" Craig sighed. "I did. Actually, my reflection did. I realized I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I let Diana betray me and then just accepted it." "I didn't betray you like that," Diana interjected, her voice strained. "I love you." "You were going to leave me," Craig said, his tone harsh. "You didn't stay because you loved me. You stayed because he chose his wife. The decision wasn't yours, Diana. It was his." Diana dropped her gaze to the floor, her eyes flickering between Craig and the counselor before finally resting downward. "Mrs. Stokes," the counselor began, sensing Diana's internal struggle. It's true," Diana admitted, almost in a whisper, though it stung to say out loud. "But what about all those great years?" she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Don't they count for anything, Craig?" Craig's expression remained flat. "You got a second chance, but I got lies. And we won't even get into Brad, will we?" "You're making a terrible mistake, Craig. I love you, and you love me," Diana insisted, her desperation rising. "When it comes to this marriage," Craig said, his voice steady but cold, "obviously this won't be my first mistake." Diana's face twisted in pain at his words. "I don't want a divorce. I don't want a divorce," she shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. But Diana didn't get what she wanted. At 64, she found herself living in a small apartment in a senior housing complex. The bitterness quickly set in, and even her grandchildren were less enthusiastic about her visits. Craig, on the other hand, also ended up in a modest apartment but in a regular section of town. He decided to embrace his retirement as a fresh start. He bought a Harley-Davidson Road King and spent the spring, summer, and fall riding across the country, photographing the scenic landscapes along the way. Occasionally, he even sold a photo to a magazine for a little extra cash. Though he hadn't been single in over 40 years, Craig found that dating in his 60s came with certain advantages. The ratio of single women to men worked in his favor, and while he wasn't chasing after wild nights of passion, he still found companionship. His good health and charm helped him connect with women who appreciated his company, and more often than not, they were pleased with his performance. Brad was happy to see his father thriving in his new life, though he and his sisters had hoped Craig would stay married to their mother. Unlike his sisters, who sided with Diana, Brad understood his father's decision and respected it. After all, Craig had been clear about what he needed, and neither daughter pushed him too hard once they saw his resolve. While Diana, now Grandma Stokes, became less popular with her grandchildren, Craig transformed into a superstar in their eyes. His laid-back demeanor, longer hair, and cool motorcycle made him the favorite at family gatherings. As for Brad, he waited until after Philip passed away to reach out to his half-siblings. He explained to Craig that he would always see him as his true father, and Philip as an outsider. However, his half-siblings weren't responsible for the past, and Brad saw no reason not to connect with them. Craig encouraged him, saying he had no issue with Brad learning more about the rest of his family. In the end, both Craig and Brad found ways to move forward. Craig embraced his newfound freedom, and Brad found peace in balancing both sides of his family. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button for more of Love, Lust, Lies.